This episode of Monster Memories is brought to you by the one and only Fangoria magazine. Use the promo code DeadNoiseBlog for 20% off your magazine and merch orders when you visit shop.fangoria.com. It's been a long time since the last time I've done a Monster Memories video, so there's no better time to make another one than to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the scariest movie ever made, and one of my all-time favorites, The Exorcist. Now when it comes to doing these videos, I never know where to start or what to talk about first, and this one's no exception. The Exorcist is just one of those movies that was made at the right place at the right time with the right people involved, and it's impossible to replicate it. It kicked off the popularity of an entire subgenre of possession horror, with each imitation more forgettable than the last, and even the follow-up attempts within its own franchise just haven't managed to come close to the greatness of the first one. At the same time, the fact that there hasn't been another possession movie to come close to The Exorcist in the 50 years since its release just elevates its greatness in a way. It really was lightning in a bottle when you think about it, and if there were any changes to the personnel involved with the movie, it just wouldn't have the same impact. I will say this though, it's kinda fun to imagine what it might have been like in an alternate universe though, because there were a bunch of options explored before we got the movie we have today. Just to give a few examples, Alfred Hitchcock had the opportunity to direct and own the screen rights to William Peter Blatty's novel, but he ended up turning it down. Another directorial consideration was Stanley Kubrick, and there was also a time where it was considered to only have one priest instead of two, and actors that were in conversation for the part of Father Karras included Roy Scheider, Jack Nicholson, Marlon Brando, and even Al Pacino before the studio ultimately ended up going with Jason Miller, and also casting Max von Sydow as Father Merrin. There were also a bunch of child actors considered for the part of Regan MacNeil, and many of them were turned down either because they were too young, too established, or their parents just didn't want them involved with the kind of material that was in the script, understandably. Linda Blair's own agency referred around 30 of their other clients to the studio, and Blair wasn't even considered until her own mother brought her in herself to audition for the role. For the part of Chris MacNeil, Reagan's mother, other considerations for the role included Audrey Hepburn, Jane Fonda, and Shirley MacLaine, but the first actress to undoubtedly show interest in the character, and even go as far as to personally call William Friedkin directly to tell him that she had to play the role, was Ellen Burstyn, who ended up winning the position, and also gives one of the best performances out of the entire cast. To some degree, it's a miracle the movie was even made at all, let alone released. There were a bunch of delays during production for all sorts of reasons, from technical malfunctions to reshoots to a handful of different cast and crew adjacent deaths to even having the set catch on fire. And after all these delays, not including the time that was spent filming in Iraq, the production schedule eventually went from 85 days to 224 days. And according to the Shudder documentary Leap of Faith, William Friedkin on The Exorcist, the studio didn't seem to have much faith that the film would even make much money at the box office to begin with, and there was even some conversation before it released to theaters on just shelving the project entirely, and it didn't help that they were uneasy about how their reputation would change because of the subject matter involved with the film. But thankfully it wasn't shelved, and it's one of the most iconic movies ever made, never mind just being a giant success for the horror genre. To this day, it's still one of the highest grossing movies ever made when adjusted for inflation, and the only Warner Brothers film that's outsold it to this point is Barbie. The Exorcist opened the week of Christmas to a mixed reception, but a very loud one that led more and more people to see it each day just to see for themselves what all the talk was about. Some people loved it and recognized it as the masterpiece it is, while others, unsurprisingly, were repulsed by it and disregarded it as gratuitously disgusting because they couldn't see past the surface of what it was all about. Needless to say, the movie quickly became a cultural phenomena, and it was still a critical success, being the first horror movie to be nominated for Best Picture at the Oscars that year, along with several other nominations, winning Best Sound and Best Adapted Screenplay, not to mention the nominations and wins from the Golden Globes as well. Both Gene Siskel and Roger Ebert gave it 4 stars, which was an insane achievement, especially because of the fact that Siskel was super critical about movies that torment children like Poltergeist, but even he loved The Exorcist. So let's talk about what makes this movie so great, because there's a lot of ground to cover. First, it's just a solid concept that's executed really well on multiple levels, and that's the subject of good versus evil. There are a lot of layers to it, most prominently the priest versus the demon, obviously, but it also shows in the way the film looks and sounds, because the scenes were specifically designed to contrast between being brightly lit and super dark, along with loud and quiet. It also just feels real in a way, because not only are the characters very well developed and easy to get invested in, but the fact that there's barely any music, especially when things really start to hit the fan, helps so much with giving the movie an authentic feeling about it. Sure, there are unused scores that can be found on the internet, and they're insanely creepy to their credit, but I still can't help but feel that the movie is creepier without the music. And obviously the cast is just perfectly selected. Everybody puts their best foot forward, and it's really obvious when you watch it. I mean, to put it bluntly, the performances from the cast just feel genuine, and all of them are fully immersed in their roles. Jason Miller in particular, just by example, spent 3 weeks living with the Jesuits in Georgetown before filming even began. He picked his wardrobe from the collection of clothing from the dead priests that used to live there, and he even learned how to say the Catholic Mass from the technical consultant Father William O'Malley, who also coincidentally played Father Dyer in the movie. He also had the diary of the exorcist that conducted the ritual in the real-life case that the novel was based on. So yeah, for those who don't know, The Exorcist was loosely based on a true story in some way. In 1949, a teenage boy was considered to be demonically possessed and eventually underwent exorcisms in both Georgetown and St. Louis from January to March of that year. The boy's identity was left anonymous in the media for decades, using aliases like Roland Doe and Robbie Mannheim, but after his death in 2020, it was eventually revealed in December of 2021 that his name was Ronald Hunkeler, who grew up with no recollection of the events of his exorcisms and had a successful life and family of his own. This case inspired author William Peter Blatty to write the novel The Exorcist, and the rest is history. Another thing about the effectiveness of the movie is the location of it and how Georgetown plays such a prominent role throughout the movie. The whole environment of the film is contained within a couple blocks of each other, with the exception of the opening prologue in Iraq, of course, but having everything located both on and around the campus of Georgetown University gives it a small town feeling where everyone knows each other, making the events that much more impactful. It's also fun to think about how the locals were involved behind the scenes, because a lot of the extras were Georgetown Society members instead of trained extras, and also Georgetown University students charged money for people to watch the finale being filmed with Father Karras' character falling down the steps at the end of M Street. And there was even a point during production where a basketball game was played between the film's crew and the university's faculty. The movies also brought a lot of tourism to Georgetown, with people going to see the house and the steps all the time. But what people might not know is that while in the movie the McNeil house is right next to the steps on M Street, it's not like that in real life. It's a little bit off to the side, but it was made to be located right next to the steps by adding an artificial wing to the already established exterior that's on 3600 Prospect Street Northwest. And that extra wing that was added specifically for the set of the movie allowed Reagan's bedroom window to be directly above the steps. Another fun fact is that the filming of that iconic shot of Father Merrin arriving at the house had a visit from the fire department, with the story being that the crew had to use so much fake fog for that scene because the wind kept blowing it away, and eventually people began thinking the city was on fire, so the fire department was called. Now, as far as the real freaky stuff, as far as the special effects go, The Exorcist was a movie that really pushed the envelope. It might seem a bit tame by today's standards, but back in 1973, there was nothing like it. It took several different tests to get Reagan's possession makeup to the point that we see in the final film, and the credit goes to the makeup master Dick Smith, whose assistant happened to be none other than a young Rick Baker, who would later go on to do the amazing effects for An American Werewolf in London, The Howling, Michael Jackson's Thriller video, and even Gremlins 2. On a real note, without their work in particular, the movie wouldn't be half as powerful as it is, because they really knocked it out of the park, from the prosthetics to the dummies to everything in between. They even did such a good job with aging Max von Sydow, who was only 44 years old at the time, that people in the audience thought that he was just that old in real life. Linda Blair wasn't the only person in her position either. There was another actress named Eileen Dietz who sat in during some of the more gruesome moments of the movie, including that one scene, you know which one I'm talking about, don't make me show it. Dietz was also made up as Reagan during the infamous projectile vomiting scene, and the story behind that scene that you see in the movie is that it wasn't supposed to hit Jason Miller in the face, it was supposed to hit him in the chest, but there was a misfire, and if you notice just how shocked and grossed out Miller is during that scene while he's wiping the vomit off of him, that's because that was a real reaction. He wasn't ready for that. Another challenge was finding the voice of the demon that possesses Reagan. In the end, it was voice actress Mercedes McCambridge who went to extreme lengths just to get in the character, from voluntarily chain smoking, swallowing raw eggs, drinking whiskey, and even getting tied to a chair. But before all of that, the sound department tried to see what they could do with Linda Blair's own voice. And after a combined 150 hours of trying to electronically alter her voice, Friedkin eventually pulled the plug and just opted to find a voice actor. There are even sounds of animals in a slaughterhouse added in here and there, most notably when the demon leaves Reagan and takes over Father Karras at the very end. And speaking of the demon, even though it isn't mentioned until the second movie, the demon does have a name. While it's only said in the movie that Reagan is possessed by the devil, the original novel and the movie Exorcist 2: The Heretic states that the demon is really named Pazuzu, which is about the only thing the Heretic gets right, by the way, but that's another story for another day. But it still makes sense to simply say it's the devil for two different reasons. Number one, it's just a lot more dramatic and shocking to the audience, but also from a ritualistic perspective, it's considered a sign of weakness for the demon to really reveal its identity. So to just lie and claim he's the devil himself makes perfect sense from the perspective of the demon. Look, there's a lot of trivia I could get into when it comes to this movie, but I'd like to think we all know the stories of how the original teaser trailer for the movie was banned because it was considered too shocking for audiences, or how both Linda Blair and Ellen Burstyn sustained permanent back injuries because of faulty equipment or operator error, whatever you want to call it. And if you didn't know all that, well, now you do. But one more thing I want to point out is the existence of two different versions of the movie, the original theatrical cut and the extended director's cut, which was released in 1998 for the movie's 25th anniversary and marketed as the version you've never seen. Full disclosure, I'm more partial to the extended cut because I feel like it just lets the movie breathe more and allows it to feel even more real and just leave more of an impression on the viewer. After being conditioned to that version, it makes the theatrical cut feel like a breeze and almost rushed in a way. I also enjoy the added exposition in the director's cut, but it's perhaps best known for the spider walk scene, which, coincidentally, William Friedkin denied the existence of that scene for years before the 25th anniversary release added the footage in. One reason it was cut from the original version was because of how shocking it was, but more so they just couldn't find a way to hide the wires until they were able to digitally get rid of them decades later. So 50 years later, The Exorcist is still the scariest and one of the absolute best movies ever made, and its impact still has yet to be matched. I'll never forget how much I wanted to see this movie when I was younger, simply because of its status as the scariest movie ever. Getting into the horror genre at a young age, the title and the status caught my radar pretty quickly, and I just knew I had to see it. But, growing up Catholic, my parents weren't too fond of the idea, and it would be years before they'd finally let me watch it. In the meantime, I had done so much research on it before then that you would have thought I helped make the movie, but nonetheless, when I was finally given the okay to watch it, it was like nothing else. I wasn't scared by it because I'd already known what to expect, but that still didn't stop me from appreciating every aspect that went into pulling it off, and also anxious to see what would happen from scene to scene and how everything would look. So was it the first horror movie I ever saw? No. Was it a super scary experience to see it for the first time? Not really. But my curiosity and interest in it from a young age is something that still sticks with me even today, with it still being one of my all-time favorite movies. I watch it every year during the Christmas season and on Easter, which are both pretty fun traditions when you really think about it, and even after all these years and all the times I've seen it, it still never gets old. So for the Exorcist 50th anniversary, if it's been a while since the last time you watched it, check it out again and see if it's as scary as you remember, or show it to someone who's never seen it and watch how they react, because that's always my favorite thing to do. With that, thanks for watching, and remember,
the power of Christ compels you! The power of Christ compels you! The power of Christ compels you!